I stood motionless in the center of the Grand Marina Club's private dining room. My left eye was swollen shut, dark bruising already, staining my cheekbone. 50 high society guests froze, their champagne glasses suspended in midair, staring in absolute shock. Beside me, Justin attempted to mask the brutality of what he had done behind his trademark charming smile. Have you ever felt like you had to carry a heavy secret just to keep someone else's world from falling apart? Drop a comment below with where you are listening from. I would love to welcome you to our community. Justin's fingers dug into the fabric of my dress like iron clamps. He practically dragged me away from the staring guests and shoved me into the private executive lounge just off the main hall. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, instantly muffling the nervous murmurs and the soft jazz music playing outside. He backed me against one of the leather sofas, his face inches from mine. His voice was a vicious, controlled whisper. He hissed my name, Samantha, telling me to stop looking like a tragedy, to fix my face, and to maintain the perfect facade for his multi-million-dollar real estate investors waiting in the pavilion. He reminded me that this $40 million waterfront marina project was the absolute pinnacle of his career. He promised that if I ruined his most important night with a pathetic display of victimhood, he would make me regret it for the rest of my life. I did not cry. I did not ask him why he was doing this. The panic that usually paralyzed my throat was completely gone. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical and precise. I rubbed my good eye, trying to summon some lingering affection, some thread of regret for the man I had spent 10 years with. But there was only absolute, crystal clarity. This was not an emotional breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and his account was heavily, irrevocably overdrawn. The moment Justin turned his back and stepped out of the lounge to greet the board chairman, I moved. There was no hesitation in my hands. I did not shake or second-guess myself. I reached into my evening bag and pulled out my encrypted tablet. The quiet, rhythmic tapping of the digital keys was the only sound in the room, creating a sharp sensory contrast to the muffled laughter and clinking champagne flutes of the elite crowd just beyond the walls. I had been the silent investor in their version of our family for a decade. Now, I realized it had been a subscription, with me constantly footing the bill. It was time to cancel the service. I logged into the architectural firm's master server. With 3 deliberate strokes, I revoked Justin's executive clearance to all of my structural patents. The intricate designs that formed the bedrock of his entire marina project were now legally locked away from his company. Next, I accessed the financial portals. I navigated directly to the offshore accounts tied to his development firm. I initiated an immediate, comprehensive asset freeze, locking down every single cent of his liquid capital before I even stood up to return to the gala. They were not going to be shocked by what they had done to me. They were going to be shocked that I had finally stopped playing along. I slipped the tablet back into my bag, smoothed my dress, and prepared to walk out. The retaliation was already in motion, cold and relentless. Our 10-year marriage had been entirely built on my quiet sacrifices. During the early days, I was the one who funded Justin's expensive real estate licensing fees and his initial startup costs. I paid for his ambition using my grandfather's architectural royalties, all while enduring a strict, suffocating financial isolation that Justin carefully orchestrated under the guise of budget management. Over a decade, those daily micro-coercions eroded my baseline of self-preservation. People often wonder why someone stays in a situation like that, but they do not understand the invisible chains of a survivor. It is the neurobiology of trauma bonding. The cycle of subtle abuse followed by breadcrumbs of affection creates a chemical dependency in the brain, keeping you trapped in a perpetual state of appeasement. You do not stay because you are weak. You stay because your nervous system has been systematically rewired to believe that their approval is your only source of safety. You mistake coercive control for love until the very concept of autonomy is completely bleached away. And speaking of bleach, the reality of my life had never been clearer than on the morning of our 10th anniversary. I had saved for months from my private design commissions to buy a custom raw silk gown for this gala. It cost $600, a modest sum for their circles, but a fortune for me given my restricted access to our accounts. I had laid the dress out carefully on the dressing table in our master suite. When I returned from the shower, the acrid chemical smell of household bleach burned the back of my throat. Brittany, Justin's malicious sister, was standing in the doorway with an empty bottle in her hand. The bleach was eating away at the raw silk threads, turning the elegant ivory fabric into a ruined, dissolving mess right before my eyes. The tactile imagery of those beautiful threads disintegrating perfectly mirrored what they had done to my life. Brittany just smiled, claiming she had tripped while cleaning the bathroom. It was a calculated, deliberate act of destruction, designed solely to remind me that I was not allowed to shine. When I told Justin about it at our anniversary dinner that evening, he barely looked up from his steak. Lauren, his other sister, sneered from across the table. She told me to stop being so cheap and overly dramatic about a rag. She then demanded that I immediately transfer $6,000 from my personal design earnings to her boutique's account, insisting I needed to buy a proper replacement dress from her failing business to avoid embarrassing them at the gala. I did not argue. I just transferred the funds. For 10 years, I had paid the invoices of their cruelty. I had swallowed their disrespect to keep the peace. But sitting in that lounge, holding my tablet, I recognized the truth. I was no longer bound by those invisible chains. The neurobiology of my appeasement had finally broken, replaced by the cold, hard mathematics of getting even. The physical culmination of their psychological warfare had happened just hours earlier, during a brutal afternoon ambush at our Lake Forest home. I had been in the living room, reviewing architectural blueprints, when Brittany and Lauren barged through the front door. They cornered me against the heavy mahogany bookshelves, screaming about a $24,000 catering invoice for their fraudulent boutique business. They demanded I liquidate my remaining personal savings to cover their debt. When I calmly refused, stating I was not going to fund their mismanagement anymore, the hostilities snapped from verbal to physical. Lauren shoved me hard against the wood, and Brittany struck me across the face with the heavy clasp of her designer handbag. The impact shattered the skin near my cheekbone, my vision flashing white with sudden, blinding pain. What was truly chilling was not the violence itself, but the deeply pathological normalization of cruelty within their family unit. This is the ultimate normalization trap. In a narcissistic hive mind, the family uses collective gaslighting and scapegoating to entirely dehumanize their target. They operate as a single, toxic organism that projects all of its failures onto the scapegoat, allowing them to inflict devastating abuse without ever feeling a single shred of shared guilt. They do not see a person bleeding in front of them. They see a problem being managed. Justin walked into the living room right as I collapsed onto the floor. I looked up at my husband, expecting intervention, or at least shock. Instead, he watched the assault completely impassively, his hands casually resting in his pockets. The domestic quietness of the house after the assault was terrifying, broken only by the steady, low hum of the central air conditioner and my own ragged breathing. He stepped over my legs, looked down at my rapidly swelling eye, and called the battery a necessary act of corrective discipline. He told me that my defiance was unacceptable. Then, he delivered his final command. He ordered me to wear the dark, blossoming bruise to the waterfront gala that evening. He wanted me to stand in front of his wealthy colleagues with a disfigured face, a public monument to his control, just to prove that I finally knew my place in his empire. He was so deeply consumed by his own narcissistic God complex that he genuinely believed his charm could explain away any atrocity. I did not cry on that living room floor. I did not beg for his help. I simply stood up, wiped the blood from my cheek, and walked to the bathroom to get dressed for the gala. I realized then that I was no longer a wife dealing with a difficult family. I was a hostile auditor trapped in a house of unrepentant criminals. The battle had decisively shifted from a private, shameful realm of domestic abuse into a cold, calculated, and strategic sphere of institutional warfare. I knew my place perfectly. My place was right behind the trigger of their absolute public destruction. The narrative in my mind snapped back to the present moment as I walked out of the executive lounge and re-entered the active gala. The grand pavilion was a sea of silk, expensive perfume, and arrogant wealth. I glided through the crowd, my bruised face drawing gasps and horrified whispers from the elite guests, exactly as Justin had intended, but he had no idea that I had brought my own silent reinforcements. Across the crowded, glittering room, I made direct eye contact with my twin sister, Hannah. She had successfully infiltrated the high-profile event by posing as a supervisor on the private venue security detail. Dressed in a crisp, tactical black suit, she stood near the main stage exits with her hands clasped professionally in front of her. We shared a powerful, nonverbal bond across the room. a twin connection that required no words to communicate that the trap was perfectly set. Pinned discreetly to her lapel was a high-definition body camera. It was not just recording, it was linked to a mass broadcast protocol, ready to simultaneously blast the devastating video and audio feed directly to the smartphones of every single VIP investor sitting in that pavilion. Just behind the heavy crowd, near the Grand Marble entrance, my parents, Richard and Patricia, arrived quietly. They did not mingle. They did not speak to the hosts. They stood with observant, steadfast precision, each carrying thick, certified dossiers containing complete forensic financial audits of Justin's entire corporate operation. This was not a spontaneous, emotional retaliation. This was a highly coordinated legal execution. The irrefutable findings inside my parents' folders had not just been compiled overnight. My father's corporate defense lawyers had already submitted these exact ironclad audits to federal prosecutors 48 hours prior to this gala. We were not looking for a family apology tonight. We were looking for a federal indictment. I watched Justin near the podium, arrogantly prepping his keynote speech, adjusting his silk tie, and laughing loudly with a group of major investors. The tactical execution of our live stream setup was a beautiful juxtaposition to his arrogant ignorance. He was completely oblivious to the legal reality closing in around him. He thought he was untouchable because he believed he controlled the narrative inside this room. He did not know that a heavily armed team of federal marshals was currently stationed in a fleet of unmarked cars at the venue's perimeter. They had coordinated with my father's legal team on the exact timing of the raid. I wasn't signaling them to enter. I was simply timing my public checkmate to perfectly coincide with their inevitable arrival. I was fighting them with undeniable forensic mathematics. Every piece of the board was now locked exactly into place. I calmly took my position near the front row of the pavilion, folding my hands together and watching my husband step proudly up to the microphone, perfectly ready to let him dig his own corporate grave in front of the entire world. Justin tapped the microphone, a slick, practiced smile spreading across his face as he looked out over the sea of 50 elite investors. He launched into his arrogant keynote speech, smoothly claiming absolute credit for the architectural design and financial execution of the $40 million waterfront marina. He spoke loudly about integrity, about his visionary leadership, and about building a pristine corporate legacy, all while his wife stood bleeding and bruised in the front row. I did not interrupt him with a shout. I did not make a scene. I simply tapped a final, pre-programmed command into the encrypted application on my phone. At the exact same second, Hannah moved swiftly to the venue's central audiovisual booth. With clinical, synchronized precision, we executed a complete, hostile takeover of the main central projector feed. The massive digital screens behind Justin instantly went black, abruptly cutting off his glossy promotional video. A split second later, the high-definition images of our certified forensic audits flashed brilliantly across the massive displays. The suffocating, absolute silence of 50 elite investors watching Forged Bank Signatures project in high definition was entirely deafening. The ambient music had stopped. The polite clinking of champagne glasses ceased. Every single eye in the room was locked onto the devastating criminal revelation unfolding on the screens. The financial documents clearly outlined a systematic, meticulous embezzlement scheme. Page by page, the audit exposed that Justin had illegally siphoned $1.2 million directly from my private investment portfolios. The screens displayed the exact routing numbers, showing precisely how he had desperately used my money to illegally float Brittany and Lauren's fraudulent, failing boutique businesses. There were fraudulent power of attorney documents and wire authorizations bearing my signature, projected 30 feet high for the entire room to examine. Next to them were the verified reports from a federal handwriting expert proving they were blatant forgeries executed by my husband's own hand. I turned my head slightly to look at my sisters-in-law. Brittany and Lauren's instantaneous panic was a spectacular, deeply satisfying sight. The arrogant color completely drained from their faces as their offshore wire transfers, complete with dates, times, and exact dollar amounts, were laid bare for their entire high society circle to see. The glossy facade of their successful boutique empire was reduced to a miserable criminal reality in a matter of seconds. Justin stopped speaking. He turned slowly to look at the massive screens, the microphone slipping from his trembling fingers and hitting the stage floor with a sharp, electronic squeal. His jaw went slack, The charming developer who had brutally assaulted me hours earlier was suddenly gone, replaced by a terrified man staring directly at his own federal conviction. This was the lethal checkmate. By broadcasting his financial crimes to his institutional board and his primary investors simultaneously, I had irrevocably destroyed any potential redemption for their family. It was no longer a domestic dispute, it was a massive corporate fraud playing out on a live broadcast. I stood perfectly still, watching the empire he built on my back shatter into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. The shock on the stage lasted only for a few agonizing seconds before Justin's absolute panic violently morphed into animalistic rage. Realizing his entire corporate life and social standing were completely over, he let out a guttural scream and lunged directly off the low stage, charging straight toward me on the live camera feed. He never made it to me. Hannah moved with blistering, tactical speed, intercepting his path and instantly tackling him hard to the polished marble floor. She subdued him with a brutal, highly practiced efficiency, pinning his arms sharply behind his back, while her live body camera continued to broadcast his pathetic, thrashing humiliation to the massive projector screens above. Right on their precise, pre-coordinated schedule, the heavy oak doors of the Grand Pavilion burst open. The federal marshals entered the room in a highly organized, tactical formation to officially execute the pre-approved federal warrants. The visual imagery was stunningly chaotic. The sharp, crystalline clatter of expensive champagne flutes shattering against the pristine marble floor echoed through the hall as elite guests scrambled out of the way of the federal agents making the immediate arrests. Lauren and Brittany immediately dissolved into hysterical, messy tears. Their arrogant, superior masks totally crumbled as they fell to their knees in their designer gowns, desperately begging me to kill the projector feed as they watched their precious social status vanish into thin air. I did not kill the feed. I just watched the accounting balance itself out perfectly. 18 months later, that terrible night feels like a lifetime away. Justin is currently serving a lengthy federal prison sentence for multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. Brittany and Lauren face total corporate bankruptcy, their fraudulent boutique businesses seized and systematically liquidated to pay back the remaining financial restitution owed to my private investment accounts. I did not just take my money back and quietly walk away. That is the true, profound justice of the seed planter. Punitive revenge only destroys the toxic weeds, but genuine restorative justice requires you to cultivate the cleared soil. I took the recovered funds and officially established a non-profit architectural studio dedicated entirely to designing safe, beautiful transitional housing for survivors of domestic abuse. I spent a decade having my personal foundation eroded by people who desperately wanted to keep me small, so I decided to spend the rest of my life building unbreakable, solid foundations for others. The peaceful, warm morning light streaming into my independent design studio is the absolute best return on investment I could have ever asked for. I've come to realize that breaking invisible chains doesn't just mean escaping the people who deeply hurt you. It means using the heavy iron they tied you down with to forge something generative and enduring. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to finally set yourself free. Real strength isn't just walking away. It's building a life so solid that their cruelty can never touch your foundation again. If Samantha's journey reminded you of your own worth, hit share, leave a comment, and let us know your thoughts.